Welcome back, everyone. We are going to continue our conference, and until now I really enjoyed what has been presented and told. And I think what we are doing is we are looking at very important issues here, both from a research point of view as well as from a practice point of view, as was demonstrated in the last presentation by Marshall Geiger. We are going to continue now, and Jean Bédard will take the floor. And Jean, he actually conducts natural experiments. He does all kinds of archival work on audits and audit matters. He looks into regulation. He looks into auditing standards, the role of audit committees, and he looks into the value of auditing to society. He's an acclaimed researcher, and his top publications are impressive by the sheer number, and content. Today, Jean is going to talk about internal controls. The title of his presentation is the auditee's internal controls and financial reporting quality. And I'm looking forward to his presentation.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm very glad to be participating at this online conference. I would have loved to be in the Netherlands, sure, at this time of the year, but that's still great to be there. Up to now, I enjoyed all the presentation. What I will be talking now is about the research project that actually was funded by FARS and a literature review that came out of that project, which is on the internal control and its relationship to financial statement quality. This project is done with some of my colleagues from Maastricht University, Annelies, Nadine, Mathis, and Karen, as well as Mieki from Ascot University and Li Zhu from University of New South Wales. The presentation will be as follows. I'll talk about some of the background of the project, then the internal control over financial reporting and the role of the auditor, and some research opportunity in the area. So let's look at the background first. Like I said, this project comes from FAR fundings, which is a project that we had submitted in 2018, and we got funding from it. Where the objective was to try to look at the influence of the auditor evaluation on internal control. Mainly wanted to look at the factors that affect the auditors in his judgment or judgment. Just a moment, I'll put my presentation on full screen. Sorry for this. Okay. Okay, so we wanted to look at the factors that influence the auditor evaluation, the effects on the auditor's substantive procedure, as well as the effect of the internal control evaluation and the procedure on the financial statement adjustment, meaning kind of the quality of the financial statement in this case. And the first part of this was the literature review. We're still working on the project. We received part of the data, and as soon as we get the other part of our data, we'll be able to proceed with the analysis. So what I will be presenting today is really the literature review. Let's look at an historical perspective. The internal control is not something new, although we talk about it since the year 2000. In the 70s, surprise, there was some audit failure, like we had maybe 20 years ago, and maybe we'll have in the future. And at that time, the internal control received a lot of attention from the US Congress, who passed the Foreign Corrupt Practice Act, which required companies to have at least US companies to have an internal control system. At the same time, audit firms were interested in research in the audit process to make it more effective and more efficient because of some pressure as well as the technological changes. And one research project that was important at that time is the MOC Ted Muck research project that he performed at Pete Marwick Mitchell at that time, which is now KPMG. And based on the research that he did with that firm, he published a nice CPA research monograph looking at the auditor judgment in the evaluation of internal control. And some of the results that he found was that there was a lot of variability in the decision, there was variability in the process, recommendation, and as well as interpretation of the internal control. Based on this research, KPMG or Pete Marwick developed a new approach to evaluate the internal control with the objective of reducing that variability and maybe arriving at a better decision. In the mid-90s, with the change in the audit approach, they moved away from this CDOC approach and went to the business management process. Again, in the 2000, with the audit failure, they move away from the business management process and we move back towards the internal control and the importance of an internal control with the SOX 404. I have to say that at that time, I started my PhD at the University of Southern California, and Ted Muck was my advisor. And I did my thesis on the internal control evaluation. Why? During my work as an auditor, I found that it was very difficult for an auditor to evaluate the internal control as well as to see the impact of that internal control on the audit procedure that he or she should do. So what is internal control? Internal control has been defined as a process with different components, and the objective of that internal control is really to have a good financial statement quality. And when you look at the definition that was brought by the COSO in 1992, okay, sorry, they developed a new view of the internal control, which was more than only control activities, but a move towards the recognizing the impact of the control environment, and in particular, the role of management and of the Audit Committee on the internal control, which means a move away from the role of the auditor in internal control and a recognition that management is really important in this area. Then, if we look at the research that look at the internal control, they use the same idea. What is the impact of the internal control system on the financial statement? And what determines the quality of the internal control? And in general, research has looked at the disclosed material weakness, meaning the material weakness that were disclosed by companies after the evaluation of the internal control system and the evaluation by the auditor. And this is mainly in the US. Material weakness that they look at are, like I said, a disclosed one, and normally they are the one that will have an impact on the quality of the financial statement. So if you look at the formal definition, it will be that there's a reasonable possibility that the material misstatement of the company financial statement will not be prevented or detected on a timely basis. As we can see, it's a very difficult judgment to evaluate that because there's a reasonable possibility that the material statement will not be detected or prevented. It doesn't mean that there is one material error in the financial statement. It's only a possibility. So that judgment is difficult to make for the auditor as well as for the people in the company. Let's look at the research in the area. So first, researchers have looked at the drivers of the weakness in the financials, in the internal control. They have looked at the firm's operation, the role of the management, audit committee, and board of directors. With regard to the firm's operation, various factors might affect the quality of the financial internal control. Among them, if you have a company that is very complex, very diversified, don't have that much money, then there's more risk that you have a weak internal control system as you have less money for your system, as well as it's very complex. If you have a firm that is large, that is well established, old, that has capital need, then you have more chance that the control system will be better in this case, meaning that there will be less weakness in the internal control. Some research also found that there's an impact or there's an association with the operational aspect of internal control, not only the impact on financial statement, but the operational. Let's talk about data breaches. So they have shown that if you have some data breach, there's more risk that you have some other problems with your internal control over financial reporting, and that you will report a material weakness in the area. The other drivers of the material weaknesses are the executive, audit committee, and board of directors. This was recognized by the COSO framework, and researchers have looked at those different characteristics and really found that there's an association between the CEO's characteristic, such as age, gender, tenure, as well as CEO's incentive to disclose or to have a good internal control system. They also look at the CFO characteristic and their incentive. In general, they found that those characteristics are associated with the quality of the internal control system, and that the CFO has a greater impact on those characteristics, on the quality, than the CEO. Then they look at the audit committee. Different characteristic. The audit committee, as we know, is in charge of the process of the establishment of the financial statement, as well as the internal control system. So what characteristic has been looked at are the independence in terms of the, as defined by the exchange rule, or some other dimension of independence, such as the compensation of the audit committee, the investment in company in terms of equity, as well as ties with the CEO and CFO of the companies. In general, we find that if the audit committee is more independent, there's a better internal control quality. They also have looked at the role of the competence of the member of the audit committee. And again, if you find that you have some more competent member on the audit committee, there's a lower likelihood that you will have material weakness in your internal control. They also look at the role of size of the audit committee as well as activities, and in general, those are less significant or have a lower impact. More important are really in terms of competence. Finally, since the audit committee is part of the board of directors, which has the responsibility over all the financial statement and all the functioning of the companies, people have looked at the role of the board of directors in terms of independence as well as size of the board of directors. And they find that they have a role, but again, the principal role is really in terms of the audit committee. After the drivers, people have looked at the impact of the material weakness disclosure on the financial statement quality, the firm's operation, and financials market. So in terms of financial statement quality, we will expect that a good system of internal control is associated with better financial statement quality. And if you take the reverse, then that if you have a weakness that is disclosed by a company, that the financial quality will be lower. And in general, that's what studies have found. In terms, if you think about financial statement qualities in terms of the abnormal accruals, beating the analyst forecast, having restatement, as well as the forecast accuracy. In general, studies have found that there's a relationship between those, meaning a negative relationship. In terms of the operation, if you think about an internal control system, you might think that if you have a weak internal control system over the financial reporting, that might be an indication that overall the company have weak controls over the other part of their operation. And that's kind of what studies have found. They found that there's an implication in terms of investment efficiency. If you have material weakness, your efficiency is lower. If you have some weakness in terms of the inventory area for your internal control over financial reporting, you have higher inventory turnover ratio as well as impairments. And in terms of investment, also they find that when there's a disclosure of material weakness, there's a reduction in investment, particularly in the risky investment, meaning that there's a link between the internal control over financial reporting and the controls over the operation here. In terms of the audit now, studies have shown that if you have a material weakness, your audit fees are higher, meaning that your auditor has to do more work in terms of the audit of financial statement and maybe of the audit of the internal control over financial reporting. And they also find that it's associated with longer report lags, meaning that there's an impact on the auditor work. How do the market react to a disclosure of material weakness? They find that there's a market reaction and there might be over a long term a difference in terms of cost of equity, credit, and node sprint. But in this area, the results are more mixed. So we're not sure if there's a long-term effect or if there's an effect for the impact of the weakness disclosure for the financial market here. If we look at the role of the auditor on the internal control, well, the auditor used the internal control for his financial statement audit, and in some countries, as the US and Japan, the auditor has an opinion on the internal control over financial reporting. So what do we find for this? Researchers have looked at the impact of the internal control on the substantive procedure, and they find that there's some reliance on internal control, and sometimes, depending when, and that there's some effect on the substantive profits procedure. There's a link between the two. As I said before, previous research has shown that there's a lot of variability and it varies between the auditor and that the effect is not necessarily as strong as we might think. Some studies have shown that auditor will increase the substantive procedure, but not necessarily decrease substantive procedure when there's a good internal system of internal control here. We also find that the role of the auditor varies, meaning that the auditor's decision on the internal control varies depending on their competence in terms of experience, training, and knowledge. And normally studies have shown that if you have more competencies, you will have a better evaluation of internal controls and you will be better able to adjust your your audit programs in terms of the result of those evaluations. Studies have also looked at the impact of the internal control documentation to see if one type of documentation is better than the other and how those documentation might help improve the evaluation process of the auditor. In terms of the audit of the internal control over financial reporting, people have looked at the manager interaction with the auditors. If you think about manager interaction with the auditors, it's really the role of the negotiation in terms of the identification of the material weakness, as well as the disclosure of those material weaknesses. And people have shown that there's a negotiation process between those two. Other studies have looked at the impact of non-audit services over the disclosure and found that some have found that there's not necessarily an impact here on the disclosure. And Other studies have looked at the role of the audit, meaning, do we need to have the internal control that will be audited or not? And what is the impact of having the internal control audited by an auditor and having an opinion on this? And studies have shown that auditors are better, or let's say that there's a better likelihood, higher likelihood that there will be a disclosure of material weakness when the internal control system is audited by an auditor compared to a company that only has to disclose the material weakness without an audit.
5 more minutes, Sean.
Yes, I'm almost done. So that's the research that was done. What we see from here is that internal control, well, we said it's important. There has been a lot of research on this in the 70s, 80s, a little bit less in the 90s. It has been very, very popular after the SOX 4.4 with the availability of the empirical data on this issue. And it has shown that there's an impact, and the internal control system is something that is important in terms of the quality of the financial statement. What do we need to look at now? So let's talk about future research. What will be interesting to look in the future is really the interaction between the various actors, management, the board, and the auditor, with regard to the evaluation of the quality of the system, as well as the identification and the reporting of material weakness, where there's a lot of negotiation and each of them have a role that is different to play, and how they together, by playing this role, they can improve and evaluate the system of internal control. It will be also interesting to look at new tools for internal control evaluation. In the last 10 years, we have moved towards more and more computerized system, and data analytics is starting to be used in audit office as well as in companies. So it will be interesting to look at how it is used and how it can be used to evaluate the internal control system here. For the disclosure of internal control weakness, it will be interesting first we have to understand that having a disclosure of a material weakness is not necessarily an indication that there's not having a disclosure of internal control weakness doesn't mean that the system is good. There might be some weakness that were not disclosed, or there might be some that were corrected before the end of the year. So it doesn't tell us what is really there in the company during the year. So it really will be interesting to look and talk with companies and see data that come from companies to understand really what is the situation in terms of the internal control quality, to have a better indicator of that quality. Another question is, should internal control of financial reporting should be audited? As I said, there's 2 countries in the world that are doing it. Should we have it every year? Should there be only every 2 or 3 years? What is the cost-benefit analysis of this? Is it too costly? Not. And what is the best way to have this? As I said, and also, in the end, most of the studies that we reviewed are coming from the US. And as I say here, the US is only one of the 195 countries in the world. So there's other countries where we should look at internal controls, and there's other way to give information of internal control weakness that are there in the world. And I think there's a need to have a better understanding on what's happening elsewhere in the world. In particular, if you think about internal control, one dimension that is very important is the idea of the culture, firm culture. And so how does it work? How does it change in different countries? What will be the impact if you look at some other countries except different than the US? What will be the impact on the quality of the internal control system? So thank you for, I'm trying to get the last slide, does it work? So thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward for the discussion of these after this presentation.
Thank you very much, Jean, for this presentation. A very important topic indeed, and I would like to invite Emil Polstra, young professional at Mazars, to actually discuss your presentation and also to allow the audience to participate in this. Thank you. Emil?
Yes, thank you very much for the presentation. I have some questions from the audience, and the first to start with is to what extent does the size of the role of the Audit Committee in determining the scope of the audit engagement affect the likelihood of material weaknesses to occur?
That's a good question. I'm not sure it has been examined in the research to this moment, meaning the role of the Audit Committee regarding the scope of the audit engagement and the link with the internal control weaknesses, because that's information that is mainly within the companies, and most of the research I've looked at what has been published by the companies in terms of internal control weaknesses and what is public in terms of the Audit Committee characteristic. But to my knowledge, the role of the Audit Committee with regard to the internal control over financial reporting is not that clear, because it's not mandated by the regulation. It's kind of part of what good directors should do in the companies, and since it's related to financial statement quality, it's normally the Audit Committee that should do that. So I think that's an interesting area that should be looked at in the future research, meaning that what is the role of the Audit Committee with regard to the internal control? Is it formal or not? And what do they ask to the auditor to do with regard to the internal control within the companies? And do they want the auditor to test that control or not, and rely on it or not, and why they're not relying on it? So that will be interesting future research, probably using some type of interview or survey data for this. Mm-hmm.
Yes, okay, thank you. Another question, internal controls of the auditee itself, including governance environment, is one of the clearest examples of interdependency in the coordinating network. That's a quote from Knechel et al. At 2020 of the auditor and the auditee. But the auditor, of course, can't hide behind the auditee. Should auditors become more strict in their communication over internal controls, or should the reader be educated to read the warning signs the auditor already communicates?
To my knowledge, the auditor don't communicate that much regarding the internal controls to the investors. Okay, we have communication in the US with the audit report on the internal control system, but in the rest of the world, there's almost nothing. Some companies will communicate information, like in Canada, companies have to provide an opinion on their own internal control system, but the auditor is not involved in that. So should the auditor provide more information? But I think it's probably related to what we will see with the CAMs in the audit report. Maybe the auditor can communicate why he or she's not using a mixed approach to this test and just using a substantive one because there's material weakness in the system, and he or she has to change his program regarding this. But right now it's really, really limited with regard to this issue. Mm-hmm.
Yes. Yes, there's also another question, I think, on this topic. It's quite a long question, but I will paraphrase it. And it actually says when internal control weaknesses are found, most of the time the auditor performs additional substantive testing, and at the end they come to the same level of assurance. And the person who asked the question makes a statement that, in his opinion, the auditor can't really give the same level of assurance when they cannot rely on internal control. So maybe you have some views on that, how we should look at that. because we can give one opinion as auditors, but there are multiple ways of getting there. And as the question asker also says, there's another different predictive value when you can't rely on internal control.
I kind of agree with this comment, meaning that in the past, internal controls was like relying on internal control was more like a business decision for the auditor. Is it more costly or less costly to rely on it or not? With the change in the internal control system and the accounting system, where it's more computerized, it's more and more difficult not to have some degree of reliance on the internal control system, because all the data that is entered there is through a computerized system. So if you don't have the adequate control for the data entry, how can you perform substantive procedure on data that is now on the computer system and not paper like it was in the past from the outside of the firm? So there's some degree of reliance that is necessary. So probably the response will be, it depends on the type of weakness that you have in the internal control system. And if it's more in terms of the IT problem, then maybe it has an impact on the quality of your substantive procedure, because they have to rely, if you cannot rely on outside source of data in this case. Mm-hmm.
Yes. Okay, another question. Is there an effect of audit committee or auditor interlock effect? For example, the transfer of good internal control practice from one company to another company on the quality of internal control?
We can hope or expect that there will be an effect, because studies in other areas of audit committees have shown that good practice are transferred from one firm to the other through board members and audit committee members. There's been a study in the auditing area where people have looked at the transfer of knowledge through audit committee members who had experience with the disclosure of internal control weaknesses in some companies. And when they are in other companies, they find that there's kind of a learning curve. So there's less problem in those companies, meaning that they probably now realize the importance of the internal control and ensure that they have an adequate system to evaluate it and test it before year end.
Yes. Regarding avenues for future research, are you aware of any research that investigates differences between auditor and auditee perceptions of what constitutes effective internal control on financial reporting, and which of those perception correlates most significantly with actual financial reporting quality?
I'm not aware of research that have been looking at this directly. I think it's a very interesting issue, because you have the companies who perform the evaluation of internal controls, and then the auditor, at least in the US, who perform it on the other side for that report. And I'm sure that they have different experiences, and it's a difficult judgment, so they might have different view about the importance of a weakness. And they also have different incentive. Many studies have shown that executives who disclose internal control weaknesses have higher probability of leaving the company in the subsequent year, particularly the CFO. And the auditor, on the other hand, wants to have the disclosure because that's part of his work, and there's also some liability issue with this. So there's conflicting view. So that could be a very interesting issue to look at in future research. Mm-hmm.
Yes. Often internal control frameworks are very elaborate. What is your vision on reporting on a more concise set of internal controls that focus on the key risks comparable to the key risks in the director's report? And if so, how should it be decided? What are key risks?
I'm not sure what is my view now. I know that companies right now have to, like you said, disclose what are the key business risks. And then after that, at least here in Canada, they can provide more or less information about the way they control this risk. and what is are the procedures that are there to reduce the risk. Should we do the same thing with the internal control system for the financial statement? What are the key risks there, and what is the company having in place for this? But that could be an expansion of the what we have in terms of disclosure of internal quality by the companies. So that I'm not sure if there's a demand for this. Okay, maybe as a researcher, I would love to see this, but in the end, we really need to have the detail of the internal control system of the company and the main risk, or at the end, only the opinion about the internal control of the companies provided by the company, audited or not. So I don't have an answer on this, whether it should be there or not, but I think that's something that should be looked at and maybe studied. Mm-hmm.
Right. Is there also research relating IT quality or knowledge within organizations and material weaknesses?
Yes, there have been some study on this, and what has been found is that these material weakness, IT material weakness, have a greater impact in terms of financial statement quality, and they are also more difficult to remediate. When they are disclosed, after that takes a while before they're remediated. But when they're remediated, they have the highest impact in terms of increasing the quality of the financial statement. So IT weakness or IT controls are very, very important in company. At least that's what those two studies are showing.
Audit profession regulators are more and more critical on auditors' reliance on internal control. And this causes auditors to move more to substantive testing, mostly by less expensive staff in comparison with the relative expensive and experienced staff needed to evaluate controls. How do you expect that this influences the natural advising role of the auditor?
If we think in terms of advising roles for the internal control system, that might reduce this advising role, but actually I'm not aware. I know that regulators have been very critical of the quality of the internal control evaluation by the auditors in terms of what they're doing for the audit. Does it mean that they should move towards substantive procedure instead? I don't think that's the right solution. To start with, they should, I think, look more at what is needed in terms of internal control quality. And if I look at the new international auditing standards that just came in during the last year, there's more work required for the auditors in terms of the evaluation of risk associated with internal control system. So I think the move by regulators is more to require more work than less work. So I think they should work that way.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Those were all the questions we have received. So thank you very much for your answers. And I think it's a very interesting field, internal controls, both for researchers as for practitioners as well. As we already discussed, there are a lot of points we can further investigate and look into. So I think that's interesting for the coming years. Thank you.
Thank you.